So the social
So I'd like to
construction
go
of
back
race,
to a
or this
question
process
that I
by which
posed on
people
a
come to
previous
define
one,
a group based
and
not
that
only on
is,
physical
how does
characteristics, but
racism
also their
differ
historical and
from
culture and economic
ethnocentricity?
factors, is based
Ethnocentricity
in
is a belief that one
racialization.
culture
So
is superior to
racialization is a
another,
process
similar to
of ranking
racism, right?
people on
There's
the
that element
basis
of
of their
superiority.
presented race.
But the difference
Okay.
here isn't in
And
necessarily the
so
people, but in
one
the
of the ways of doing
practices, right?
this
So
or
culture is the
forming race
totality
is
of
perhaps
learned
using socially
science or
transmitted
using
customs,
a
knowledge,
narrative
material,
of
objects, and behavior.
some sort.
And so cultures,
Um,
even among
and
racial groups,
whatever process is
can
used,
be
we call
diverse,
that
just like
racial
ethnicities
formation.
among racial groups can
And this
also
is a
be diverse,
socio-historical
right?
process in
And
which racial
so when it
categories
comes
are
to culture,
created, inhabited,
people
transformed, and
tend to
destroyed.
be at least
All,
somewhat ethnocentric,
all in a
to view
moment.
their own culture
So
as
some
the
examples of
standard or the
this racial
norm
formation would be something
and
like
or
a
as being
reservation
superior to
system for
others.
Native
And so
Americans and
that might
indigenous.
include judging other
The one
cultures by
drop
one's
rule,
own
saying that if you
culture,
have
a
one drop
comparison to your
of
own culture
whatever
as the norm or as the right way to do things.
minority blood,
And
then
again, most of us
you
are
belong to a
taught
certain race
that,
or ethnic
our
group,
own schools
right?
or our own
Or that you
countries or
have those
whatever, our
characteristics.
food, whatever, is the
Ideas about
best, right?
miscegenation or
Some
any
sort
kind
of
of idea about,
nationalism,
interracial mixing,
patriotism, it evokes an
or
element of
exogamy, outmarriage
ethnocentrism.
that actually has some sort of
Sociologists push us to at least achieve some level of
ranking
cultural
on
relativism.
those
So that means viewing
mixes
people's
that may
behavior
be looking at
as from
some
the
form of
perspective of
breeding and from
their own
land.
culture.
And then
And so
even
instead of
looking at
looking at
othering,
another
right? Of the
ethnic
idea
group's
of saying
behavior
that
and
a
comparing it
group
to
of
my
people is
culture, I
other,
can
that there is a
compare it
norm,
instead
and
into the
everyone who doesn't
norms
fall into
within
that norm is
that
an
ethnic
other.
group's
And we
culture.
even seen this in the past, in the US, especially with
So you can
the
see a
othering
bit
of other
that
white ethnic
these
groups, right?
things,
So Eastern
racism and
Europeans versus Western
ethnocentrism, that
Europeans
they
and things like
share
that.
some
We
characteristics
can
like that
we don't have to look back
superiority,
too far to see
but that they are
examples
also
of,
social
for
constructions,
example,
and
the
that they
Irish
can be
who weren't viewed
manipulated,
as being white,
right? As a
right?
social
Who weren't
construction, we
afforded
can even manipulate
the
something that seems a bit more real,
the
like
benefit of
ethnocentrism,
whiteness for a
right?
very long
Or
time, at
until it
like culture or
became
ethnic,
um,
or ethnicity. There's a lot of words getting
helpful
jumbled up
or
here.
beneficial
Um,
for other
and
whites.
kind of meld them into one
So
another.
typically, we
Because one
have
thing
these
you'll notice
processes
is that in some
where
examples,
we
ethnicity and
define
race are actually
what a
used
race
hand in
is,
hand. Now,
and
typically, this is
figure
not true,
out
but we do have some
who
examples where
receives
race
more
and
benefits
ethnicity than
actually
others and
overlap.
power and
All
privilege
right,
than
and so let's look
others.
at one of those examples
And so
here
the
and how
major
that's
effect of
changed,
racial
right? An
categorization
example of
then
how
is
it's
defining
dynamic.
who has more power and privilege than others. And then those racial constructs include political meanings and social meanings. Okay. And so that's why sociologists still find them socially significant, because we still see those political and social meanings showing up in our statistics, right? In the data analysis that we do, we see that there are some people who are identified with certain races or some groups who are faring well or better in society than others. And so that's why it's important that we still ask people what is their race, because we still have these differences. And so until those differences no longer exist, we still have to ask those questions so that we know where the fight is. We know what to tackle. So here's one example, and you might have already caught this earlier. If you did, just wait for a moment, right? Don't spoil it. But look at this example and think, who could it be? They are distinctly marked: the small and somewhat upturned nose, the black tint of the skin. They are ignorant, and as a consequence thereof, are idle, thriftless, poor, intemperate, and barbarian. Of course, they will violate our laws, these wild bisons leaping over the fences which easily restrain the civilized domestic cattle, will commit great crimes of violence, even capital offenses, which certainly have increased as of late. Who could it be? So, if you're thinking about this from a racial perspective, right, you might be thinking, oh, obviously it must be, it's written in English here, right? We can see this image here. We see Uncle Sam, so we know it's relevant to the United States. You can see in the image like 76, abolished is written there, and other words that look very familiar. And so we might be thinking this must be the enslaved people of the US. This must be like Black people. It says the black tint of the skin. It might be natives or indigenous people. Um, Obvious. But the reality is that we're not looking at a racial distinction here. We're actually looking at an ethnic distinction. And who is being spoken about here is Irishmen or Irish people in the United States, those immigrants to the US, who had not been viewed as white previously, right? They did not view them as having a shared sense of identity, as having a shared sense of belonging, right? And actually looked at those symbolic ethnicity signs, right? Things like the food, the music, the clothing, and used that as a way to say that their culture was inferior, right? And this stigma was as deeply tainting of their skin, even as race. And we can see that historically that has changed, right? It hasn't completely been wiped away by history and time, but a lot of that has dissolved to the extent where people don't say, well, what kind of white are you? Or anything like that, or walk up to white people and say, where are you from? Who are your people? Typically, they're accepted as white. And especially for others, we view them, and I say we because I'm from a community of others, usually as being white and belonging to whiteness. Right. And so it's really, really interesting how those lines can blur and cross, and how they can, be used for division or be used for a shared sense of identity or solidarity as well. So really interesting in looking at how race and ethnicity are involved in the idea of racial formation. It's all kind of jumbled up. It's a hot mess, right? And so we're going to be working on doing a bit of untangling and exploration and understanding, right? Some of this goes into something called cultural intelligence, and other areas go into cultural competence and how important they are for understanding culture and ethnicity. Cultural intelligence describes this ability to communicate and interact with others of varying backgrounds and cultures, awareness of biases, and respect for others' uniqueness. And so that can help with developing this cultural relativism. Cultural competence is an awareness for one's own cultural identity, a self awareness, self education, right? An acknowledgement of interaction and understanding how your own cultural identity has been composed, a competence of your own cultural identity. So let's return for a moment to that racialization that we brought up early. And let's look at some of the racist framings of race, right? The term race and its existence altogether, the categories of race, this understanding of difference between peoples based not on ethnicity, but based on phenotype, is racism. Okay. It is embedded in racism, right? This idea of ranking people, this racialization, it's not old, it's very new. And it is the inception, like the conception of racism in the world. And so scientific racism, right? This idea that, that race was embedded in science was part of the initial justification and rationalization for racism, right? So science was used as an authority to justify and legitimize race. And so we started with these ideas, right, of four categories of races based on embodiment. And so of Europeans, of South Asians, of North Africans, of Americans, right? And then again, looking at Africa proper, then Asia proper, and then the lapse, and saying that these were distinct categories based on shared phenotypes across these four. Right. And if you're a little confused, look to your text. Your text has a lot of explanation of this and review of the four categories of races. We had this guy named Blumenbach, and this guy basically was thought of as being the founder of anthropology and is who we thank for the study of phrenology, which phrenology, when I first learned about it decades ago, is laughable. It was a pseudoscience that we actually believed in, of classifying people based on their skulls and the bumps along their skulls and the shapes and the sizes of our skulls. And so they would look at these skulls, Caucasian skulls, Mongoloid skulls, Ethiopian, American, and Malay, and try to guess You know, who had the best skull qualities? What do you think the outcome was? Of course, it was the Caucasian skulls were ranked as the best because, again, who's forming the narrative? Okay. And so this led into racial formations, right? These understandings that were justified. And then it led into some other scandalous thought systems like social Darwinism, coined by this guy, Herbert Spencer, a horrible sociologist, who basically claimed that we should have a survival of the fittest based on socially being fit, right? And so we shouldn't be helping the poor. We shouldn't be helping the meek, the impoverished, but just kind of letting them die because they were socially unfit. And that was a result, of course, of their genes, right? And so eugenics in the United States and beyond was inspired by social Darwinism, inspired by Herbert Spencer. It was put into place by many others in the United States. Margaret Sanger was one who we know well through the controversy that is Planned Parenthood now, who we thank for Planned Parenthood now, but who we also are very much aware of the racist roots of Planned Parenthood. So you should go take a look at that. It is a hot mess. So yeah, thanks for that. But your history is a bit of a kerfuffle. So yeah. Sociology is also controversial in some of its thought. For the most part, we are typically progressive. We typically are not racist. But you can see that we did have some sociologists who use their powers for evil. So this is just one example.